Welcome, Kevin, and everyone here, and there'll be a few others dropping in, I'm sure. But we'll turn it over to you, Kevin, and you're welcome to really, we've take your time and go through what's really kind of on your heart and mind from your most recent study.
Well, thank
Let's,
you, Don.
yeah,
I've been on the Oak Center mailing list for a while, at least a year,
yep,
probably a couple years now, and
mhm,
this is actually the first time I've been able to participate. So I'm
wonderful.
delighted to be
Yeah,
here, even just for that reason. And yeah, looking forward to sharing some thoughts, and it's a small group, so hopefully we'll have some discussion and
excellent.
we can really dig into any questions that you might have.
Yeah.
I can't promise that I have answers to them, but we can certainly
If
talk about
you have
them.
good questions, that's a start. Uh, and do you need the screen share is available if you'd like?
Yes, I do have slides, so I will take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Used to navigating Google
Oh,
Meet
right.
here, so it'll just take me a second to refamiliarize myself. But yeah, here it is. Yeah.
We're good. Yeah, that looks
Okay, there it is. And I'll go into presenting mode here
wonderful. Okay.
in a moment. Mhm. There we go. Okay. You can see that okay?
Yeah, excellent.
Wonderful. All right. Well, so what I plan to do in the next, I don't know, 40 minutes approximately is to give a bit of a précis of my latest book, which is this book entitled Secularization, Social Order, and World History. So I'll do sort of a run through of the major arguments of the book, and then I'm sure that will
Excellent.
spark some questions as well. So the topic of the book is secularization, which is probably not a word that we use on an everyday basis. Um, but if the word means anything to most people, um,
Mm,
it's usually means something like the decline of religion.
right.
And it probably conjures up images like this one. So this is a graph that I compiled from denominational membership
Yeah.
statistics from what used to be the three largest Protestant denominations in Canada.
Yep.
And they all sort of peaked out in the early to mid 60s. So this graph shows essentially percentage change since 1965. And you can see there's some differences between them, United Church, Anglican, Presbyterian. But they've all been going down, and that's
Yeah.
continued. This only goes up to the year 2000, but that's continued in the last 26 years as well. So this is one of the images we think secularization. We often think of declining church membership, church participation, attendance, and that sort of thing. Another thing that we might think of that's the mirror image of this is the rise of the nuns,
Mhm.
not Nuns,
Yeah.
but Nones, people who say they have no religion that they belong to. They're not affiliated with
Hmm.
Christianity or Islam or any of the other religions. They're just they have no religion. And so these are charts from one of my colleagues at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures at the University of Waterloo.
Okay.
On the left-hand side there showing by generation the percentage of people who identify in Canada as having no religion. And it's sort of been going up generation by generation, as you can see. Similar data from the United States
Right.
on the right-hand side there. As of the time that this was published, 2023, about a quarter, a little more than a quarter of American adults now say that they don't belong to a religion. So normally when we think of secularization, this is the kind of thing that we think of. Secularization is the decline of some identifiable thing
Mhm.
that we call religion. And implicitly, this definition of secularization, which is shared also by scholars of secularization, they have slightly more sophisticated ways of wording
Mhm.
it, but all of the definitions of secularization that are in use among scholars basically boil down to a decline in some sense of religion in some sense. So they all assume that there's something called religion that's identifiable that we can distinguish from things that aren't religion, right? So we have kind of a mental image, something like this. There's things that we
Mhm.
recognize as religion, people praying, things that happen in temples. God or the gods are involved in some way. But then
Yes.
everything else is not religion. It's secular. And I know some of these images might be obscured a little bit by
All right.
the little window here. So I can move mine. I don't know if you can move yours, but
Yeah, that's fine. I can see them. Yeah.
you can see here, so things like, work, sports, politics, family life. For most people, we think, okay, well, that's not religion. And so secularization, then, the way that we typically think about it, is that we have less of the stuff on the left-hand side of this image,
Yeah.
less of the stuff that we call religion.
Mm.
And what's left behind is just lives that are filled with the other stuff, which is the not religion stuff, the secular
Right.
stuff. And I think there's a lot of truth to this, and we'll come back to that idea.
Right.
It's true as far as it goes. But over the course of the last decade or so, in my work as a researcher and as a teacher, I kept running into clues that this might not be the whole story, and it might not be the best way to conceive of what secularization is most fundamentally. So I'll walk you through some of those clues that there might be something more going on when we think of secularization. The first clue comes from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. He wrote a very influential book in 2007 called A Secular Age.
Mhm.
That's had a big impact among people who think about secularization. And there's a ton of
Yeah.
ideas packed in there, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't agree with.
Yeah.
But one that I find really important is his idea of subtraction stories. So he makes the point that most of the stories that we tell about secularization, including the stories that scholars tell about
Mhm.
secularization, portray it as you're just taking something away. You're taking away this element that we call religion, and what's left behind is sort of the stuff of ordinary life that was always there. So what we're imagining, what scholars are imagining when they talk about secularization as a subtraction story, is that you always kind of had, politics, economics, the arts, family life,
Mhm.
sexuality, all that was all just kind of there. And then on top of that, you sort of had a religious layer or a religious veneer. And in a subtraction story, all that secularization is doing is it's sort of taking away that extra element of religion. And what's left is just
Right.
what was there the whole time. It's just the ordinary stuff
Yeah.
of human life. And so, we might say, to use a everyday technological metaphor, secularization is like deleting an app from your phone. You've got your phone, it has your smartphone. It's got an operating system and it has different apps and programs that it runs. And you used to run the program Religion a lot, and now you just don't use it very much, and maybe you just delete it altogether. But the rest of the phone is the same. The operating system is the same. The other apps are still the same. And Taylor has some criticisms of this. A couple of them in particular. So one is he points out that if we think of secularization just as subtracting something, we fail to ask, but does being secular have its own character or its own quality? Is the secular a thing? Or is it just the absence of something? But if we think of it just as the absence or just as a subtraction story, we don't ask, what is being secular like? What does it have any characteristics? Another problem with subtraction stories, according to Taylor, is that they assume that most of what went on in people's lives for most of history was really just secular all along. There's just kind of this extra religious layer, but the default, the true human condition is to be secular. Religion is just this extra thing that you don't need, the way that you do need economics and politics and the arts and so on. So that's one clue is Taylor saying, this normal way that we think of secularization, it's a subtraction story and it kind of is limited. It puts certain blinkers on in terms of how we think about secularization. A second clue comes from a group of scholars, some of them going back to the work of Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who's a Canadian scholar of Islam, actually. back in the 60s. But most of the scholarship has really been in the last 2 or 3 decades. It's sometimes called the critical religion school. And their basic idea, which they've, I think, demonstrated now very conclusively, is that the concept religion itself, which we assume when we think of secularization as the decline of religion, that idea, religion, is not an idea that you find in all human cultures. They don't have a category, religion. And this is true in other cultures in the world. So, for example, in India and China and Japan, prior to their encounter with Europeans during the age of exploration and European expansion, their languages did not have words that fulfilled the same function as our word religion. It doesn't mean that they weren't religious in the sense that we usually mean that word. In fact, they very much were. But they didn't have a word for this thing called religion that was distinct from the rest of life. That's very interesting to me. So the words that are used today in China and Japan for religion, for example, come from a decision by the Japanese government in the late 19th century. So only about, 150, 170 years ago, the Japanese government said, we need a word to translate this word that the Europeans have. And they took an existing word that they had for describing different types of Buddhism and they repurposed it. And then that word was, then the Chinese government followed suit later on, and they actually used their equivalent of the Japanese word to fulfill the same function. But this is also true if you go far back into the history of Western culture. The word religion, the way that we use it today, you actually don't find people using that word or its predecessor words the way that we use it now prior to about the 17th century. In fact, the Latin word religio, which is the ultimate ancestor of our word religion, didn't mean at all what we mean by religion. And if you're interested in that, we can dig into some of the specifics of that later on. But you may have noticed, even the Bible, our English translations of the Bible, only very rarely use the word religion. There's only a few instances in the Old and New Testaments. And if you look at the underlying Greek or Hebrew words that are being translated religion there, you find that those words actually have a very different, what linguists call a very different semantic range. They don't translate very directly into our word religion. They overlap a little bit, but they really have quite different meanings. So, in other words, the idea that there's this thing called religion, which we can distinguish from the rest of life, is that word and that concept is a uniquely modern and uniquely Western way of thinking. It's not culturally universal. So that's interesting as well in terms of if we think of secularization first and foremost as the decline of religion, we're actually thinking of secularization using a concept that was only thinkable in the modern West. And in fact, I argue in the book, is itself a product of secularization. We're using secular concepts to think of secularization. So that's the second clue. I've got a quote here kind of summing up this school of thought from one of these scholars, Brent Nongbre. He says the concept of religion does indeed have a history. It's not a native category to ancient cultures. The idea of religion as a sphere of life separate from politics, economics, and science is a recent development in European history, one that has been projected outward in space and backwards in time. And there he's saying by scholars who then use this concept to make sense of these other times and places. My third clue comes from an American sociologist named Philip Rieff. He died about a decade ago, or maybe 2 decades ago now. Very, very eccentric fellow, Jewish, largely secular Jew, but his Judaism, his Jewish inheritance identity became more important to him over time. He's known mainly as a scholar of Freud. He wrote a lot about Freud. But towards the end of his life, he wrote a series of books, um, one of which is pictured here, in which he makes the case that what human cultures do is they turn sacred order into social order. And what he means is that the social order, the arrangements of human institutions and the patterns of human life in all different parts of society, in most human societies, are meant to reflect something sacred, something that is higher than or above human beings. So in other words, we could say in almost all human societies, there's some kind of suprahuman cosmic reference point, and then human life, we try to conform to that higher cosmic sacred thing. In monotheistic cultures, where Christianity or Judaism or Islam is dominant, this is God and God's will. We try to conform life, social life to God's will. But there's other versions of this that are different in other cultures. There's different concepts, some of which we'll talk about later on, that represent this idea that we have an orderly, meaningful, purposeful cosmos, and human life and human society ought to conform to that. They ought to mirror that in some way. It's a little bit like the idea. It's actually a lot like the idea in the Lord's Prayer that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. We find some version of that idea in almost every human culture in terms of the way they order their society. So, my book is an attempt to sort of pull all of this together. Charles Taylor's critique of subtraction stories, the discovery that religion as a concept is actually a really novel, recent idea of Western culture, and Philip Reef's observation that normally in human society, social order mirrors or reflects sacred order. And I try to pull this all together. And to do that, I introduce a new concept building on Reef, which I call sacred social order. This image is used on the cover of the book. It's the picture of a ruins of a temple in Cambodia in sort of the Angkor Wat region where there's all these old Hindu and Buddhist temples that are now partially overgrown by the jungle and so on. So, what do I mean by sacred social order? Well, sacred social order is an alternative to religion, an alternative concept to religion. If religion is like an app on your smartphone, sacred social order is like the operating system of the smartphone within which all of the apps operate. Uh, and pre-modern societies and non-Western societies, in other words, almost all societies prior to the last couple centuries, functioned as a sacred social order, where the ordering of society, every area of society, was aligned with some idea of an order that is higher than human beings, to which we owe reverence and obedience. God or the gods or Dharma or the Tao. We'll talk about those in a second. And unlike religion, which we think of as just one aspect of life, again, like an app on your phone, that just has to do with certain kinds of activities in certain places and people, sacred social order is all encompassing. It includes not only the activities that we think of as religion, it does include those, but it includes not only the activities that we think of as religion, it also includes law and government. It includes the calendar, the way that we order time collectively. It includes the ordering of public spaces in cities. It includes marriage and family and sexuality. It includes the economy. It includes the arts. It includes the transmission of culture from one generation to another, which includes education. So all of this is part of a sacred social order. And in a sacred social order, all of these things are pointed to something higher than us as human beings. They are justified in terms of something higher than us as human beings. and they get their direction and their orientation from something that is higher than us.
Mhm.
And in the second part of the book, at some length, I demonstrate that this was, in fact, what pre-modern societies were trying to do. And not only is it what they were trying to do, they actually had words for this. They didn't have words for religion that translate our modern use of the word religion, but they did have words like in Indian traditions, the word dharma, which is used in what we call Hinduism and Buddhism and related traditions. And dharma is really hard to translate into European languages directly, but it sort of encompasses law, duty, justice, rightness. It's basically the way of doing things, the way of ordering things, including social institutions, that fits with the grain of the universe. And in fact, that upholds the cosmic order within human society. So that's dharma. That's essentially a word for what I'm calling sacred social order. Another example is the Chinese concept of the Tao or the way. And the Tao, which is an important concept not only in Taoism, but also in Confucianism and in Buddhism as it has come into East Asia, the concept of the Tao basically says there's a right way of doing things. There's a right path that we ought to follow. And the Tao actually encompasses the whole order of nature, what we might call natural laws and the seasons and the patterns of the cosmos. That's all part of the Tao or an expression of the Tao. But also in human society, we ought to follow the Tao as it applies to human life, not only as individuals, but in terms of how we order government and the calendar and our work together and so on.
Mhm.
In fact, C.S. Lewis, some of you will
Right.
be familiar with his book, The Abolition of Man. In the appendix, well, and not only in the appendix, but he uses this term Tao as kind of a stand-in for this universal recognition across human cultures that there is a right way of living
Right.
that we ought to follow. Likewise, the
Yeah.
Islamic notion of Sharia, as in Sharia law. Interestingly, it also comes from a word that means sort of like a path or like a way that you follow to like get to the oasis or something, right? So it's a path that you navigate. And it's law and it's Islamic law, but that doesn't mean that it's only about what we call religion. Sharia refers to, in the Islamic understanding, God's will for all of life. It encompasses not only things like prayer, but it also includes what we might call criminal law. It includes rules relating to food and hygiene, marriage and divorce, inheritance, and warfare. That's all covered in Sharia. So, in short, all of these concepts are naming what I would call sacred social order. And I make the claim in the book, every historical society that we're aware of uh, has been a manifestation of sacred social order, their understanding of sacred social order. There's only one exception, and that is the modern West and cultures that have come under the influence of the modern West. We are the exception to this. So we're going to come back to the modern West in a moment. But one question that's very interesting for our purposes is, can a sacred social order be changed? Can it be replaced? And there are lots of examples of this in world history. Most of them have come about because there has been foreign conquest or foreign cultural influence where another culture's sacred social order comes in and ends up replacing or modifying what was there before. But there is one instance in world history where a movement arose within a society that ended up toppling the sacred social order and permanently replacing it with a different one. And this is ancient Rome. And so in the book, I look at the Christianization of Rome as a case study in a revolution of sacred social order, where a sacred social order ends up actually being overthrown and replaced. And in the case of Rome, in the case of the social order of Rome, this really happened in the fourth century AD, the century of Constantine and his successors. And what happened in the fourth century Roman AD is that paganism and Christianity basically switched places, where paganism went from the dominant position to sort of marginal and increasingly sort of barely tolerated. Christianity went from marginal and not really tolerated at all to dominant. That happens over the
Right.
course of the 300s AD. Now, this included what we might call the decline of paganism. Fewer and fewer people believing in the pagan gods, going to the pagan temples, carrying out pagan ceremonies. In fact, some of them become banned or have to be done in secret. So there's a decline of paganism. That's part of what's going on here. But the change was much, much, much bigger than that. Much bigger than that. And that's because what we call Roman paganism was not just a religion in the way that we think of that in the modern West. It wasn't only
Mm.
a religion, something that's limited to worship and prayer and things that happen in temples. But it was woven through the whole of Roman society, the whole structure of it, from their understanding of political authority to their laws, to their calendar, to the physical layout of their cities. There are rules around marriage and sexuality, and their approach to education. All of that had to do with the gods. They didn't just hive that off in one corner that they called religion. And one example of this that I find fascinating is that the priests of Rome, the different colleges of priests that they had, were drawn from the Senate. So the priests were also senators. In fact, the Senate could only meet in a space that they called a templum, which is where we get our word temple. It was a defined space where you could undertake augury, which is various practices they had for trying to ascertain the will of the gods. So they would try
Mm.
to the main purpose of the Senate was to determine what is the will of the gods. Should we go to war this spring or not? Should we make a treaty with these people or not? Should we change this law or not? So in ancient Rome, there's no division between politics and religion. Paganism is it suffuses the whole social order. In other words, they had a pagan sacred
Mm.
social order.
Right.
And so when Christianity overthrows the dominance of paganism in ancient Rome, it changes everything.
Mm.
It affects all of the areas that I mentioned, the laws, the calendar, the function of the Senate, the physical spaces in cities. The sexual mores very dramatically changed because of Christianity. So, yes, it's a change of religions in our modern sense, but it's so much more than that. Okay, so at this point, you may be asking
Mm.
yourself, what does any of this have to do with secularization? So I'm going to bring it back to secularization. So, secularization, in my view, is a revolution in social order. In fact, it's the overturning of the prior dominant sacred social order, which in the case of the West was early modern Christendom, the sacred social order of early
Mm.
modern Christendom. And so this has a number of implications. If we think of this as kind of like analogous to what happened in Rome, ancient Rome in the fourth century AD, there's kind of at least these four implications or four theses that we can draw out. So first of all, secularization is not just the decline of one aspect of life that we call religion, but it's actually a revolutionary reorientation of all social domains, not just religion, but politics, law, education, the way we think of time, and so on and so forth, right? You can multiply the list to encompass really every aspect of social life. And so, second, this means that secularization involves not just a subtraction story. It's not just taking away this thing that we call religion. It's actually building a new kind of social order. It's a construction story
Mhm.
of a secular social order. In fact, the world's first secular social order. This is the first scale, the first society-wide attempt on the scale of a whole society to create a social order that isn't aimed at or aligned with some kind of sacred cosmic order that's higher than human beings. And that brings us to the third point.
Mhm.
Instead of trying to align social order with something above the human, a secular order seeks to ground itself in purely human considerations. And so it's actually a rejection or a repudiation of sacred social order as such. It's not a change from one sacred social order to another like we have in ancient Rome. It's overthrowing a sacred social order, in this case of Christianity, and replacing it with something quite different, a secular order. But this does not mean that the secular order is neutral or empty. And this is the fourth point.
Right.
But it has its own master values that you might even call sacred
Mhm.
values that govern all social domains. The difference, though, is that these are humanistic values. They don't appeal to anything other than us as human beings. And you can actually have different versions of this. And if you're curious, we can talk about some of the
Right.
different versions historically. But the version that's dominant in the West, for the most part, since the advent of secularization, really centers the autonomous individual as sacred. So the will of the individual human being is the sacred thing. Um, and that is the core value, the value of individual autonomy. And remember, the word autonomy comes from the Greek
Mm.
words for self and law. So to be autonomous means
Okay.
you're a law unto yourself, right? And so what we try to do in our modern Western social order, which is a secular order, is to justify all of our social arrangements in terms of the individual autonomous person. So politics, the way we practice it, is a mechanism for translating individual wills in the aggregate through a democratic process into policies and laws that we can live with. The supreme law in modern Western societies is what is embedded in things like charters of rights and freedoms, bills of rights, human rights codes, because the function of these is to ensure that no laws can exist that contravene this sacred principle of individual autonomy. And in the latest kind of version of this that we've had for the last
Mm.
50 years or so, and with increasing intensity,
Mm.
it's particularly individual autonomy in the area of sexual identity and sexual behavior and sexual expression that
Mm.
is kind of the most sacred of the sacred category of the individual autonomy. And so this is the one thing that sort of can't be questioned or challenged. All other social arrangements and laws have to sort of be brought into conformity with that. And we see this in other domains as well. I won't multiply examples too
Yes.
much, but I'll give a few more. The arts, we've come to think of the arts, the creative arts, music, the visual arts, and so on, really as vehicles of self-expression of the individual.
Mm.
And so anything that might interfere with that constraints of religion or tradition or standards of beauty or obscenity laws, that all has to go. It has to be subverted, it has to be overturned because it blocks unfettered individual self-expression. Likewise, education, we think of education as liberating individuals from the constraints of the past and enabling them to choose their own identity, their own values, and their own path through life. Maybe you were born and your parents told you that you're a woman, you're a girl. Um, we can't see that as a thing that is given and built into the natural order. That's something that has to be changeable if the individual wants it to change. If that individual feels that she is not a girl, she needs to be able to change that. And so we've shifted away from talking about biological sex to talking about sex assigned at birth. It's not a permanent thing, it's a thing that can be changed as we seek to maximize the ability of the individual to invent themselves and to express who they feel that they authentically are. Marriage, likewise, is a voluntary contract between two individuals, right? If one of them decides this isn't working for me anymore, they should be free to change that. And so we've moved towards, from a view of marriage as sort of a covenant that involves not only the people who are married, but the interests of their children, of the church, of society at large, to thinking of marriage very much as a private contract between two individuals, or maybe more than two individuals, for their own purposes. So, anyway, this gets worked out across different social domains. So, to sum up,
Right.
it's true that secularization involves the decline of religion, the way we normally use the word religion. So that's true. But if we think of secularization primarily that way, I think we're actually missing a lot of the picture, which is the fact that we're not just taking one area of life that's kind of shrinking or becoming less important, but we're actually reconstituting the whole of society, the whole social order on a new basis, which is humanistic, as opposed to referring to something above human beings. So yeah, that in a fairly brief
Mhm.
nutshell, looks like I pretty much hit my
Okay.
pretty much hit my time limit
Right
there.
on.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear.